Hello everybody, this is Gary Mrozinski. Welcome to Chapter 2. Most of the content from this presentation will be from the McGraw-Hill textbook, The Macroeconomy Today by Schiller and Gephardt. And in this chapter we'll be comparing the U.S. economy to other economies across the globe. As we discussed in Chapter 1, there are different types of economic systems. And some economies are based on the market system, where the market mechanism is guiding economic activity. Others are based on the command system, where government directive is guiding economic activity. And then there are economies in between those two extremes. Here are some interesting statistics about the U.S. economy. We have, first of all, less than 5% of the world's population. Actually, it's 4.4%. And yet we're producing more than 20% of all of the goods and services in the world that are produced. So that makes us pretty productive per person in our population. We're the largest producer of goods and services. We have the largest economy. We're also the largest consumer of goods and services. So that's not surprising. We don't produce everything we consume. We specialize in producing certain types of products, goods and services, and then we import others. We export some goods and services, we import others. So one of the things we'll discuss in this chapter is how it's determined what types of goods and services are produced inside our economy and what types of goods and services we're happy importing and letting others produce, other economies produce. That's part of the discussion of this chapter. Now we're ready to formally define gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is a measure of the total amount being produced in your economy, and here's how it's measured. It's the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's borders in a given time period. So usually we're thinking about annual GDP. So then it would be the total dollar value of all the goods and services that are produced within our borders by all businesses that produce goods and services within a year. That's annual GDP. And it is the way we measure an economy's size. Again, the US, our GDP is 20% of gross world product. 20% of all the goods and services that are produced in the world are produced within our borders. And we have less than 4.4%, well, 4.4% of the world's population. So that means per person in our population, we're very productive. That's sort of a way to think about productivity, which we'll talk about in this chapter. Our GDP is 50% larger than that of China, but China is 4 times our size in terms of population. So we are much more productive per capita, per person in our population. China has 18% of the world's population, and they're producing 17% of the world's goods and services. So they're sort of the average producer in terms of production per person. This is a column chart which shows various economies of the world. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's showing you the largest economies of the world in terms of gross domestic product, and you can see that we are in the trillions, actually the tens of trillions. In the US in 2018, GDP was 20.6 trillion. So a trillion is 1,000 billions. And in 2019, we were up to 21.5 trillion. Then we had a downturn, and COVID caused a downturn in 2020. In 2021, we don't have numbers yet, but we will soon. All right, so you can see the second largest economy in 2018, still true today, is China. So they're about a third smaller than the US, which makes us about 50% larger than China. And I believe it was 2010. I was teaching this course at another college, and that was the first year, if my memory serves me right, that China had a larger economy than Japan. Japan had always been the number 2 economy, US, then Japan, and then China passed Japan, I believe, in 2010. And you can see they've really continued. Their growth rate per year has been really fast since then. We'll talk about that more this chapter also. Now this is GDP, total amount produced, total dollar value. So a country that has a larger population, you would expect them to have a larger GDP. Comparing the US to Germany, for example, Germany is much smaller than the US, so you would expect us to be much larger. Even more important than gross domestic product is per capita gross domestic product. So this is when you take GDP and divide it by the size of the population in that economy or in that nation. So that is production per person. So it's really a measure of productivity. So GDP would be a measure of production, total amount produced. GDP per capita would be a measure of productivity, amount produced per person in your population. Now that's not per person in your labor force, that's per person in your population. So we're going to learn in a future chapter that only about half of our population is in the labor force, is working or trying to work. The other half is either retired or is underage, meaning, in most jobs you need to be 16 or older to work. And then there's other categories of people who are not working. So only about half of our population is working. So per capita GDP is a measure of total amount produced per person in your population. This is the best indicator of standard of living that we have. The best economic indicator of standard of living or quality of life. Now there are flaws. It's not a perfect indicator of standard of living, and we'll look at that further when we get to chapter 5, but it's the best that we have. So it's good to use to compare ourselves to other nations of the world. This column chart shows you some values for GDP per capita in different economies of the world. And this is, again, not an exhaustive list. We are actually not the largest. There are countries that have a higher GDP per capita than us. Luxembourg is one of them. Luxembourg, a very small nation in Europe, has $100,000 as their GDP per capita. But you can see in 2018, we were $63,000. Germany, that's an economy that we consider to be comparable to ours, but quite a bit less. Canada, Japan, you can see they're all quite a bit less than us. And I want you to think about that number, $63,080. That's the total amount of goods and services produced per person in the population. That's kind of like an average income of a citizen of the United States. So what do you think about that as an average? And the average income per capita is actually a slightly different number. That's measured to, we won't get into the differences here, but it's pretty close. So $63,080, it's roughly equal to the average income per American. How do you feel about that? Does that seem higher than you expected, or lower, or about right? I'm not going to give you too much time because this is a recording. You can always pause the recording while you think about this. I'm going to give you my thoughts. I think that seems really high. Keep in mind, this is income per capita, total amount produced per person in the population, not per person in the workforce. So, we have a whole chapter coming up on the workforce and unemployment and all of that. And I hate to spoil a question I'm going to ask you then, but I'm going to ask you, what percentage of our population do you think is in the workforce, is actually working or seeking work? It's about 50%. Only about half of our citizens, half of our population is working or seeking work. And the rest are retired, or maybe they're underage, or some are choosing not to work. but that's, or institutionalized. So those groups of people make up 50% of the population. The other 50% are working. So that means if only half of the population is working, the people that are working must need to have an average income that's twice this amount for this to be our GDP per capita. So $120,000 as an average income. Now that seems really high. You'd have to just think about your own family. So if you have, like in my immediate family, me, my wife, my son who's 16, he's not working, and I'll count my father. He's 87, he's retired, and he's not working. Only 2 of the 4 of us are in the labor force, and that makes us the average family. So for us to be the average family, then my wife and I would each have to be making $120,000. That's a lot of money. Well, the reason that that number is so high is because of, if you've taken a statistic course, the arithmetic mean, the simple average, as a measure of central tendency can be distorted by an extreme value. And what that means is if you have 1 or 2 really high values, it brings the average up. So that's the case in our population. We have a small percentage of the people that make way more than whatever the average is, and that brings the average up to what seems like a deceivingly high number. Anyway, I'm getting off track here, but this is an important number because GDP per capita is the best reflection of the standard of living or the quality of life in an economy. So that's what we use to compare ourselves to other nations of the world, GDP per capita. So economic growth, we're always concerned with how fast GDP is growing, right? Really, we want GDP per capita to grow because when that happens, your standard of living is improving. That has been happening. You want for your GDP to grow faster than your population size, right? In the US, GDP has grown roughly 3% per year. Now, this is since World War II, the post-World War II US economy. We usually look at that era because everything that happened before then was real crazy. We had World War II. Before that, we had a depression. Before that, we had World War I. Before that, we had Reconstruction going back to the Civil War. So real big ups and downs. And really, things started to stabilize post-World War II. So since World War II, about 3% GDP growth long term. And that might seem like a small number to you, but that's actually pretty good. If you can grow, if you're already pretty productive, it's harder to grow faster than 2 or 3% per year. Our population has grown about 1% per year, and that's currently, that's about what it's growing. So that means if that were to happen, your GDP per capita would grow by about 2% per year, right? And again, that's considered good if you can do that. This graph is meant to show you that as a country's population grows, you would want for your GDP to be growing at a faster rate. Because if that's happening, then your GDP per capita is increasing. And you want for your GDP per capita to be increasing over time because that means your standard of living is improving. And so this is the US, and you can see the graph at the bottom is population, and then the more jagged graph that's in green above, that's GDP. Now, I can't explain to you the axis, the y-axis, because these are very different units of measure, head count versus dollars. And so they normalize that somehow so they can use the same y-axis, but we won't get hung up on that. Just know that if from left to right the graph is going up, that's growth. Well, the growth rate of the population, and I can tell you it's been about 1% per year or a little less than 1% per year in the US long term. Well, you can see that GDP must be rising at a faster rate, and in fact, it has been rising at about 3% per year long term. So if your GDP goes up by 3% and your population goes up by 1%, then that means your GDP per capita is going up by 2%. And that has been the case in the US for a long period of time, like since World War II. we've averaged about 2%, even 2.5% increase in GDP per capita. So that's about, and that doesn't seem like a lot, but if you already have a pretty high GDP per capita, it's hard to get bigger increases than 2 to 3% per year. And it accumulates because remember, that's cumulative. So the 2% year after year after year really adds up. Here's some more data that shows you how GDP per capita can increase over time. Now this data is for the period 2000 through 2018, so almost 20 years. And there was a big recession right in the middle of that span of years, 2008, 2009, the big downturn. But even with that big recession, GDP increased in the US on average 1.7% per year. And our population grew on average 0.8%, so a little less than 1%. So you can see how the math works. 1.7 minus 0.8 equals 0.9. So that means our GDP per capita increased by about 0.9, a little under 1% per year. Again, that was an unusual span of years because we had that one large decrease in GDP, that big recession in the middle of those years. And you can see, comparing ourselves to Canada, comparable, Japan, similar, France, we are considered high-income countries. Look at the low-income countries where you have higher population growth rates. That's typical in poor countries. The population grows faster. So you can see Haiti even had a decrease in per capita GDP. That means that their standard of living declined over those 18 years. Check out China, though. China has been increasing really fast. Almost 10% per year increase in GDP over 18 years. Now, I mentioned that it's easier to have bigger percentage increases in GDP year to year if you're pretty unproductive. Once you get to be pretty productive, a high GDP per capita, it's hard to grow faster than 2%, 3% per year. So they're catching up to other higher productivity economies like the US. Now, as we saw on the previous slide, richer nations, which have slower population growth, it makes it easier for GDP per capita go up, whereas poorer nations tend to have higher population growth that makes it more difficult for GDP per capita to go up because you need for GDP to be accelerating even faster. Now, when GDP per capita goes up, that means standard of living improves, right? I'm about to make a bold statement. So if you're standing up, I'd like you to find a chair. If you're sitting down, I'd like you to hold on to the arms of the chair. I don't want you to fall off of your chair. Okay, is everybody ready? The Industrial Revolution was the most important event in human history, in the history of the world. And actually, it was more than an event. How about this? The beginning of the Industrial Revolution was the most important event in the history of the world. I'm going to let you recover from that. Okay? Get a drink of water so you can calm down a little bit. You're probably a little bit heated up after hearing that news. Here's why. Since the Industrial Revolution, standards of living have begun to improve. And before the Industrial Revolution, standards of living across the globe were stagnant for thousands of years. People's living standards were not improving until the Industrial Revolution. So what is the Industrial Revolution? It began in the late 1700s in England. And this was the transition from the cottage system of producing things to the factory system of producing things. Prior to this, there was no middle class anywhere. Here are some examples. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, Greek peasants had about the same standard of living in 300 BC as they did in 1500 AD. Chinese peasants had the same standard of living from 100 AD to 1800 AD. So that's 1700 years. Roman peasants at the start of the great Roman Empire had the same standard of living as they did at the end. And that's a 1,000-year span. And you might say, why am I only talking about peasants, standard of living of peasants? Well, because in each of these cases, and in every case in every other country in the world at this time, there was a very small percentage of the population that had good living standards, the ruling class, the monarchy, and then the whole rest of the population were living in peasant conditions. There was no middle class. So the vast majority of the population of the world before the Industrial Revolution were peasants, even though there was a very small percent that were living quite well and that were wealthy, the ruling class. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that we saw the emergence and growth of a middle class in these economies that became industrialized. Okay, so what is the Industrial Revolution? Let's talk about it. As I said, it's the shift from the cottage system to the factory system. I touched on this very briefly in Chapter 1, so we'll talk more about what happened exactly. So again, this started in England, and the cottage system was when anything that's produced in the economy was produced literally in people's cottages. So you might have, during this time, a workshop attached to your house, your cottage, and you produced something, and that was your family business, and it was maybe a trade that was passed on from generation to generation. You were a blacksmith or a tanner producing leather goods, or a furniture maker or a gunsmith or something like that. Whatever you learned to produce, you produced from the previous generation, and you worked right in your house. You produced your goods, you took your goods to market, sold them, and then used that as your income to buy whatever you were going to buy. So everything that got produced was produced in small batches by small producers. The factory system, this was a new concept in the late 1700s. Someone thought of a great idea. How about if we build a large facility, we'll call it a factory. We will hire people to be our employees, and they'll leave their cottages, come to work in our factory, and then we're producing on a large scale. There's all kinds of benefits to that. First of all, we could think about the flow of work through the facility and try to optimize that. Now that we're very large, we could afford to look into and work on inventing machinery that a small producer would never be able to afford. The first important machine that replaced manpower was the steam engine. And we think of the steam engine primarily in transportation applications at that time, but it was even more important in driving factory equipment, replacing manpower in factories. So this was an important innovation at this time. And division of labor, specialization of labor. When things are being produced in cottages on a very small scale with just a small number of workers in each cottage, in each little shop, each worker needs to be more highly skilled. Now that you're doing it in a factory, let's say you're producing guns. It's a gun factory, since Eli Whitney is mentioned here. All right? You're producing rifles. If you were a gunsmith with the cottage system, you had to be pretty highly skilled, right? You had to be able to know how to make that whole gun or rifle. With the factory system, we're going to divide up. Let's say there's 12 major steps to producing a rifle. We're going to divide that into, we're going to assign 6 different people. The first worker is going to do steps 1 and 2. The second worker is going to do steps 3 and 4. And the next worker is going to do 4 and 5, and so on. So, and then at the end it's going to get assembled and maybe tested, that kind of thing. Now you don't need as highly skilled workers. If you're focusing on just doing 2 steps, you can be more productive. You can produce more per hour than if you had to do a more complex job. This is division of labor. Oh, and if you don't need as highly skilled workers, you don't have to pay them as much. So there's a cost savings there as well. Other benefits of mass production: you can buy your raw materials less expensively than if you're a small purchaser of raw materials. Interchangeable parts, this became a necessity. It was not important with the cottage system. Maybe you're making a piece of furniture. Someone will come in and say, okay, make me a dining room table for my family, about this big, about yay high and about yay wide, and can you make that first? Okay. Well, if you're making this in a factory now, one person is making the legs, another person is making the tabletop, another person is making or maybe attaching the hardware, and so on. So now the parts all need to fit together because different people are making the various parts that get assembled at the end. The parts need to be interchangeable. This is just common sense today. All of this is common sense today, but this was revolutionary thinking at the time. And so the factory system up and running in England. I mentioned Adam Smith was there at the birth of the Industrial Revolution in Scotland, and he was observing this. And then at that time, as this new economy was emerging in England, he was making his comments and writing about how what the role of the government should be and how markets should operate. What type of economy should there be? And that's where he came up with this invisible hand theory, which the market system is based on. So he was there at this time. Now, the first great U.S. industry was the textile industry in the northeast of the country, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Now, once GDP per capita started to rise in a given economy because they're industrialized, and incomes start to go up, GDP per capita starts to go up, and a middle class starts to emerge. Now, for the first time, people can afford to buy more than just the necessities, shelter and clothing and food. They can afford a little bit of leisure activities and arts. And you might say, well, some of the greatest works of art were produced before the Industrial Revolution. Well, that's true. However, a very small percentage of the population got to enjoy them because the vast majority of the world were living in peasant conditions. Other benefits of modern economic growth: social improvements such as public education. How about just that one? If the vast majority of your population is living in peasant condition with very, very low incomes, you can't collect enough money from them in taxes. If you were to collect 10% of their incomes in taxes, and that's a very small amount of money, you don't have enough money to produce public education. So it's not until you have a middle class whose incomes are higher that you can tax them in order to provide public education so that everyone can be guaranteed, as we have in the United States, at least K through 12 education. How about this? The human lifespan doubled from less than 30 years before the Industrial Revolution to 67 years today. A couple of surprising things there. First of all, only 30 years? This is before the Industrial Revolution? Well, what has improved? How about healthcare? How about nutrition? People being able to afford to eat nutritious foods if you're not living as a peasant? Does 67 years sound high to you, low to you? This is today's human lifespan. Seems low, right? But that is a global average. In the United States, it's quite a bit higher than that. And keep in mind that almost 50% of the world's population currently today even is living in poverty and have much lower lifespan because of disease and, again, nutrition. But still, that is impressive to go from 30 years to 67 years. So let's talk about the spread of the Industrial Revolution. It began, as we said, in the second half of the 1700s in England and spread to the closest neighbors. That's the Western European countries like France and Germany in the early 1800s. So that's where it spread the soonest. The U.S. in the second half of the 1800s, also Canada, Australia, and at the same time Japan. Japan was the first Asian country to become industrialized. And you might ask, why did it take a whole 100 years to reach the United States after starting in England in the second half of the 1700s? Well, there's a couple of reasons for it. We were not ready for it in the late 1700s or even the early 1800s we didn't have the workforce. We didn't have the labor force for the Industrial Revolution, and we didn't even have a strong federal government. Our population was spread out along mostly the eastern coast of the United States. By the late 1800s, there were two significant contributing factors, and I'll ask you to think about what happened in our history in the late 1800s. Ready, go. Raise your hand. Oh, you can't do that because this is recorded. Right. How about 1865? The Civil War. The Civil War brought an end to slavery, and let me back up a little bit. The Industrial Revolution, the factory system, these factories were being built in what are now major cities of the northeast of the country. So I'm talking about New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and out in the Great Lakes region, Detroit, Chicago, what are now major cities. The reason they're major cities is because these factories were being built in these cities, right in the center of the cities, because of course people didn't have transportation to drive to work. People needed to walk to work. And then housing sprung up around these factories. And the end of the Civil War, we had a migration of former slaves out of the agricultural South into the Northeast and Great Lakes region to get jobs in these factories. That combined with two waves of immigration from Europe, first from Western European countries in the second half of the 1800s, and then in the late 1800s into the 1900s from Eastern European countries. My personal ancestry aligns with that on my mother's side of the family. They immigrated from Ireland right around the time of the Civil War, and then on my father's side, they immigrated from Poland in the late 1800s. In both cases, to get jobs in the coal mines, which was the dominant industry in this region at the time. Here's an interesting discussion of how the kinds of products we produced have changed over the last 100 years. 100 years ago, so that would be 1920 or so, 2/3 of what we produced in our economy was farm goods or food, manufactured items, and mining. 2/3 of what we produce. So 1/3 then would be services. And let's just look at farm goods. So farm goods means agriculture, everything related to producing the food that we eat, even food manufacturing. More than 1/3 of our productive resources were being dedicated to producing the food to feed our population. And you're going to notice on the graph on the next slide that has declined consistently over the last 100 years. Manufactured goods has stayed relatively the same percentage of GDP, and what's happened is agricultural production has been replaced by services. And we'll talk about the reasons for that. But how is it that we now need so much fewer productive resources to produce the food that feeds our population? Well, a couple of reasons. Mechanized farm equipment makes each worker in the agricultural field more productive. And then other types of technology like pesticides and fertilizers and automated irrigation systems, all of this equipment, all of this capital that's now used in a modern day farm makes each worker more productive. You don't need as many farmers is the reason. And so those workers in our labor force are now doing other kinds of work. They're working in services. Today, 80% of output, 80% of our GDP is services, not goods. Economy. So what led to this change in the mix of output? Well, also what it was changing over those 100 years, and this is the benefits of the Industrial Revolution, your economy becoming industrialized, average incomes started to rise. So we were reaching the point where the average person had enough income to pay for food and now could afford other kinds of products. Whereas if all you can afford is food, the average person, then most of what's going to be produced in your economy, most of the demand in your economy is going to be for food and not much else. And here's an example. Ethiopia, which is still a poor nation, 50% of output is still coming from the farm sector. So there is no market for dental services there, or vacations, or even education. So here's a graphic that shows in the U.S. economy from 1800 to 2000 how the mix of output has changed. So you can see in the vertical direction you have the percentage of employment. Now this is not the percentage of GDP, but it would be comparable. So in 1840, let's say, about 70% of our labor force was involved in producing the food that was needed to feed our population. And another 20%, it looks like, were producing manufactured goods, mining, construction, all of that bundled together. And only 10% were producing services. And again, think about what the average income was of the citizen of the United States in 1840. All they could afford was agriculture and maybe a little bit of some goods and services. Fast forward to, let's say, 1950, if you can locate that. Now, agriculture, only about 10% of the jobs in our economy were producing the food that we needed. And it looks like about, 40% of the jobs were in manufactured goods, mining, and the remaining percentage in services. You know, another thing that has contributed to the decline in the number of workers in agriculture is innovations in mechanized farm equipment and the use of chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides in agriculture has really made each worker that much more productive, and even the use of computerized irrigation systems today. So we just need a small percentage of our labor force to be working in agriculture to produce enough food for our whole population. And again, because our incomes have risen over this time, we can afford the services that people in 1900 could not. This is kind of a neat exercise. If you could write down the occupations of your parents, let's make it your grandparents, and think about or reflect on, are those jobs still available, or are they the same kinds of jobs in our economy today? So think about that, and I'll go first since I have the microphone. Let's see, I'm going to think of my grandparents. On my mother's side, my grandfather, my mother's father, began his working career as a coal miner. As I said, that was the dominant industry locally. All men worked in the coal mines, almost all of them, or a large percentage of them. And this was the mid-1800s through the mid-1900s. And so he started his career there and then ended his career. The coal mines were wrapping up their operations in the 1950s already. And he transitioned to being a janitor in a public school. And my grandmother, my mother's mother, was a telephone operator working for Bell Telephone. We don't have that job anymore. That has been automated away. Okay, on my father's side, my grandfather, my father's father, began his working career as a coal miner also. And then when the coal mines started to close, he moved to a factory job. He worked at the Gibbons Brewery, which is now the Lions Brewery. The building is still standing. It's been modernized, but it's in the same location. And he worked in the bottling plant that was attached to the brewery. And he actually died on the line, died at work of a heart attack in his early 60s. And my father's mother, my grandmother, worked in clothing factories her whole life. That was tough work. I mean, sweatshop conditions. And those began to wrap up operations in the United States, in our economy, in the 1970s. That was kind of the end of those kinds of jobs, went overseas. So all four of my grandparents, the professions they had, the jobs they worked in, are no longer in our economy. Now when we return with part 2 of this chapter, which is the next video, we're going to talk about capital. And after I made this big point of telling you that capital in an economics class always means what the second bullet tells you, physical capital, meaning the facilities, the tools, the equipment, the major fixed equipment and infrastructure that businesses own, or governments or any organization, to produce their product or produce their service, produce their good. That is physical capital. That's what we're always talking about. But just this once, we're going to talk about human capital because this is a term that's used to refer to the accumulation of education, training, which leads to knowledge and skills possessed by individuals who work in our labor force. That is human capital. Each of us that works possesses a certain amount of human capital, and businesses invest in that capital as well. So we'll talk about that when we return, and I'll see you then.